I'm Eva McLean, Principal of McLean Communications and Special Advisor to CIPR International. And I'm joined here today by a fantastic panel. There's Charles Clark, Head of Communications for HSBC Global Asset Management.
Hello, Eva.
Helen Desmond, who's Client Services Director, Thwaites Communications.
Hello.
And Josh Glendinning, who's Senior Research Manager at Opinion Research.
Hello.
So welcome to you all as well. And I'd like to kick off talking about the impartiality of research. So is it no longer seen perhaps as objective and impartial these days? Josh, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, certainly. I think that research itself, there's perhaps two things within this question. Is firstly, how research is as a practice, and secondly, how research is perceived by the general public, by the communications industry. To take that first point, clearly, the goal of research is to in some way uncover some kind of objective reality about the world, to aid understanding, to enable people to make decisions. And with that in mind, I think that the research industry has always strived for impartiality, for objectivity, and the level of kind of detail and rigor that goes into research projects, from sampling through to methodology, through to outputs, is certainly something that the research industry puts a huge amount of time and effort into. I think the second point is probably perhaps the more interesting from a communications perspective, is whether or not people trust research anymore. And certainly that there has been over the years an increase in the amount of research that's being published. And as the saying goes, familiarity does breed contempt. So there is a sense in which people are becoming slightly more cynical simply because of the amount of data and research that is about. And equally, the level of competition for research when it comes to developing statistics, communicating statistics, people are a lot more, whether it's journalists or clients, are a lot more discerning about what they want to see from research, how research should be conducted. But I think that the most important thing is that the reason that research perhaps isn't being trusted is not necessarily because of the impartiality or anything to do with the research itself, but badly communicated research is bad research in my mind.
Yes, indeed. I think some of it, though, may be accused of being bad research as well. And I'm thinking here of the £350 million on the bus, which that clearly was a misleading figure at that point, because in fact that was a gross figure, and it should have been the net figure of 181 million. So that was research which perhaps did skew belief a little bit. And it's quite interesting. There's a wonderful quote, I think, from Mark Twain, who said, "A lie can travel halfway around the world while truth is still putting its shoes on." Mm. And it is very easy to have things which are not really truthful suddenly finding a grip in society. So I just wondered actually whether we could talk a little bit about the communicating of research. Actually, Helen, I wondered, did you want to jump in here as well?
Yes, I think that Josh just mentioned the issue of trust, and I think tied to that is who is giving this research, who is behind it, and do we trust that organisation, and do we have faith in their reputation, and what do we believe about them? And that's an area where I think, as communications professionals and myself coming from a communications agency, we have a really big role in helping to retain organisations to retain their reputation and to build trust. A little bit of distrust is a good thing, and we should all have a little bit of distrust. But we should, it's our job to help to build reputations. We've recently done some research with one of my clients, the Open Data Institute, who I've worked with for 6 years, on a slightly different issue, which is looking at who we trust with our data. And actually, the NHS came out top of that, followed by family and friends. So we trust the NHS more than we trust our family and friends. But actually, something which was really interesting is that we're happy to share information with people, with organisations that we trust. Trust is incredibly important, and I think there are certain things that we as communicators can help our clients do to improve trust. I think framing, when we've done some research, framing that research really accurately and carefully is important. So if it's a Twitter poll, then we say so, and if it's an omnibus survey, then we say so, and if it's a much more in-depth piece of research, then we're clear about that as well. the potential to openly publish research is a great opportunity. It's there to be scrutinised. It's transparent. It is that there is a contact that if you have questions about that data, that research, you can come back, and that it should sit alongside your thought leadership strategy, and it should align with your vision and the mission of your client.
I completely agree with Helen here. I mean, I think a little bit of healthy cynicism is never a bad thing. And I think that, the key point that I'd like to make today is that there's two ways of looking at this. The first one is, do we welcome people to look at our data and disagree with it? Yeah, we should. Absolutely. I've always thought that data should be sort of the beginning of a conversation. And anybody that reads FT Alphaville sees that. Somebody says X, somebody else comes in with Y. But I think the counterpoint to that, I think where we don't want to be, is where people are saying, I just don't believe this data. And that, I think, is a fundamentally different thing to whether that people actually agree with the output. And we've done some work internally on research. And I think what's quite interesting is that we've had people say that the data has been, a couple of % different than they thought, or has thrown up something they didn't really think about. But I would be very mindful and very nervous. And in fact, I wouldn't send anything out the door where people said, I fundamentally do not recognise this data set. Because once it's gone, it is out there and it's got your name on it.
Yeah, I from the research perspective, I think there's a very plausible but ultimately specious argument that research in some way should always be in some sense scientific, that there should be a kind of a way of understanding the world that is objectively true, and that the numbers truly reflect that. And if the numbers are wrong, then it's not a true representation of the world. I think that actually what we're talking about when it comes to research is an understanding of the world that comes far more than just numbers. So, for example, I know from personal experience, clients become very, very, anxious about whether or not every single number within an entire press release or a huge thought leadership report is correct. But if you haven't asked the questions correctly in the first place, then those numbers are all completely wrong. And I think that understanding that broader context is far more important than thinking about decimal places. And to that point, I think what the responsibility of us as researchers to people who are communicating research is not just it is perhaps encouraging those skills that we just talked about, and encouraging that cynicism, and providing the tools and frames of reference to ask the right questions.
Yeah, if I could actually pick up on something you've just said, actually, Josh. I really like the idea that data isn't just decimal points, because I think one of the things that I see when you say the word research, people immediately think of surveys, for instance. And I think when they think about surveys, they think about more the consumer end of research. What do people say about X? But I think that when I've seen some of the real requests from our wider business where people have valued the insight, it's been more technical than that. It's been verbatims, because, of course, as you go to a more technical audience, so let's make this up, CIOs of hedge funds in particular markets, you have to accept that by doing that, you are going to a much smaller sample size. So actually, your data set might be decimal points and data and 60% of etc., but it could also be lots of verbatims, because your sample size could only be 20 people. Now, having a data set of 20 people isn't wrong, because it's representative of a smaller amount of people. But I do think when you talk about data to people, they immediately think of large consumer sample sizes. And that can be right, but it can be right for that particular project.
Agreed.
Yes, I think that's brought us to some interesting thoughts on absolute truth as well, Josh, which, I think is probably a subject
it's
for another
my philosophy degree coming back in.
Well, there you are, mine too.
And mine.
Unfortunately, I don't have them.
I think this whole idea of communicating ethically and accurately is really interesting, because now we have so much data thrown at us, and we have so much responsibility to actually report it accurately. And actually things like radio particularly, or any journalist, like a big strong headline, a very simple message, which some research which is very nuanced really doesn't allow us to do. And if you're standing in front of the Today programme being grilled about something, they don't want a nuanced piece. They want something which is really going to hit the news. So perhaps we could just talk about that a little bit, how to how to communicate things ethically, but also the fact that, even reality isn't always appreciated. So I know if you ask people in the UK generally, what percentage of immigration is there, people will normally quote you up in the 20s, high 20s even, percentage-wise, where actually the figure is only 13%. So there, somewhere, the communication hasn't really come across. So would you just like to talk broadly on how to communicate accurately and ethically? Charles?
Yes, I think that's a great question, and I think Josh picked up on some of these things earlier when we talk about the fact that the data sets have got to be robust. And I know you spoke about it as well, Helen. I think data sets need to be robust so people are not questioning the data, but also I think there is a requirement for the communications industry to make sure that when we do present data, we do so clearly. I'm not trying to sound flippant now, but this is something that occurred to me on the way over here. We had recycling bins in our office. And of course, one of them said there were X thousand plastic cups used last year. And you couldn't help but look at that and think, is that a lot? Is that a huge amount? Well, it's a very big building. Is it a lot? But then, of course, somebody had taken this forward in a more campaign approach and said, that's equivalent to 10 Big Bens. And that was fantastic. Yes. Now, I know that's a flippant point, but I think it does help to sort of take the abstract and put a little bit of context around it. And maybe that just sort of appealed to my brain, but I actually thought that was a very clever twist on what was essentially the same bit of data.
Yes, it's what communicators tell us to do, isn't it?
Absolutely.
As big as Wembley Stadium. Yeah, that's right.
One of my favourite PR headlines of recent years was that British school children spend as much time outside as prisoners. On average, which equally, probably was born of a survey, and you could say, British children spend 37 minutes outside each day, but that is not the same headline as saying they spend less, the same amount of time outside as prisoners.
Absolutely. I read an interesting something from an American think tank saying that the language which is growing most in America is Telugu, which is a South Indian, I believe, language, and it's grown by 86% in the last few years. Well, actually, it's still outside the sort of top 20 spoken languages in the US, but it's grown a lot. So it's the way we present these figures, isn't it, is really very, very key. One of the things that really has changed in recent years is everything to do with the internet, with the amount of data that we have, with what's being thrown at us all the time. And I think it was the Russian Minister of Defense who said information is another type of armed force. Very powerful statement. But one of the things that's really interested me is open source investigation. And Helen, that's probably right up your street. You know far more about it than I do. But one of the things that interests me is that as journalists or as CIPR members, we actually have to adhere to a code of conduct. But when you're talking about open source communities and open source investigations, they're not actually bound by any codes of conduct. So how do you think that communicators should adapt to that and work at it in the face of this new growth?
Yeah. So data is growing exponentially. We collect data in a way that we never have done before on all sorts of things. Companies collect data, sensors collect data, the Internet of Things collects data. We live in this incredibly data-rich world, and that produces both opportunities, lots of opportunities, I think, in communications for us. It poses certain risks, as we've seen this year with Facebook and Analytica. We're not always really sure what other people are doing with our data, and that's quite troubling. But as I say, it produces lots of opportunities, and in a couple of ways. And I think for us working in communications agencies, it allows us to work with our clients who are collecting a lot of this data and perhaps aren't really quite sure what to do with it, and aren't really sure what stories might be in that data that allows them to talk about what they do as an organisation, about the behaviour as their customers, and about their mission. And we can help them unlock some of those stories. Josh alluded to earlier that that we need to work really closely as a double act in terms of those marketing skills and some of those data skills, and working together to make sure those stories are prized open, if you like, and communicated in the right way. But I think it does offer us lots of opportunities. The government also has huge amounts of open data sets. If you go to data.gov.uk, you can find open data on everything from exam results to pollen counts to hospital waiting times. And there are lots of opportunities for linking that open data with data potentially from your organisation to create new stories. So, for instance, we worked with a startup a couple of years ago. It was a data analyst of big data. We also worked with a celebrity scientist called Ben Goldacre, who you might be aware of, to look at one specific open data set from government, and that was on what prescription data, what doctors were prescribing up and down the country in terms of statins, and statins is a particular type of cardiovascular drug. And what we found from that data set is that some GP surgeries were prescribing very, very cheap generic statins, and some were prescribing very, very expensive statins that were still under license. And so, we were able to do some really nice analysis from that showed that there's a huge amount of money that could have been saved just by prescribing generic statins. And so they're the kinds of stories that can be unlocked.
And I think that there's something quite interesting there relating to what we were discussing before in terms of making data human and communicating data on a human level. It's that actually data now is becoming something that is also available on a human level. And I think previously there was a kind of totalizing aspect towards the collection of data. The idea of GDP being a single number that can encapsulate the entire happiness and wealth of an economy. And actually, there's quite a famous example from a focus group in the northeast of England when, people were asked, well, what do you think about the GDP numbers? The economy is going well. And somebody turned around and said, well, that's not my GDP. And I think that new sources of open data offer us the opportunity to actually have a bit more of a nuanced sense around those bigger stories. So there's the headline percentage, but delving a little bit deeper helps you to understand, okay, well, that's an average, but how does that affect people in different ways? And how does it affect people on an individual level, on a community level, on a personal level?
Yeah, and I'd add one thing to that. I think when you look at open data, one of the things that we have to have in our mind when we go out with any press release or any insight report that has data in it, people have Mr. Google at their fingertips, and they will check it out. Mm-hmm. So that's not a bad thing. No. I'm entirely happy to have statistics to be held accountable, and people want to disagree. That's absolutely fine. But I think, when people are sending anything out to mass audiences and journalists, it has just got to be completely accepted that people are going to look at this instantly. And they have the tools to do so. Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's a difference between communicating with mass audiences and communicating with a very small audience? What are the differences there?
That's a good question. I think when we're communicating with a mass audience, what I have in my mind is, for instance, a consumer research story that might go out to the national press. And what I've got in my mind when I'm thinking of a smaller audience, I'm thinking of something that might be not necessarily for media use, but it might be, for instance, to inform the strategy of a specific team within a specific business. And I think then, and this is a point that Helen made very, very well earlier, which is about what you actually want to do. What do you want to find out, and does it actually meld with your overall campaign? And I think that's absolutely key, because there are going to be ways of surveying and getting a lot of insight for sort of smaller organisations within larger businesses, and it's going to be incredibly valuable. But it's going to be feel like a very different kind of data than, for instance, a consumer poll that has gone out to absolutely everybody.
That's fantastic. Yes, go on, Helen.
I was going to add to what Charles was just saying, that I think there's an element as communicators that we have to exercise judgment in how we direct these the research findings. And, you can still have a really nice, strong headline on your press notice, and you can still have a balanced story. And, you mentioned earlier, Eva, about, the Today programme wanting the big number. And yes, they will. But also, it's our job as communicators to help our spokespeople to kind of weave in those more subtle messages. That wider story is really important. And I had a was working on a story not so long ago, which one of the findings was that it was about data trade-offs, and 40% of people would be willing to share personal information about themselves if it helped keep them safe. And we hoped that we would get some nice balanced consumer press on this, and I spoke to a journalist at the Express, and she was, we had a really great conversation, but for her it was all about terrorism. By keeping yourself safe, do you mean you can keep yourself safe from terrorism? And that was not an angle that we wanted to go down, and that certainly did not, that was not part of our vision. And so I think, exercising judgment is really important.
Yeah. Very good. I'd like to throw one last question out at you all. What's your one top tip for communicating research well? Charles?
I've got a very simple one, and that is beware of the oh no second. Once you send out your press release with your survey or your insight in it, it is out there, and you need to make sure that you are entirely happy for people to check your stats and come back at you. When we issue a press release, they do not go into a black hole. They go to a huge amount of people who are incredibly bright and incredibly switched on, who will question this, and that's exactly how it should be.
Excellent. Helen?
I would say that don't let the promotion of your research findings sit in isolation. They should absolutely be aligned with your thought leadership strategy about the beliefs of your organisation, of your client's organisation, and what they, as a company, are trying to achieve in the world and the difference they're trying to make.
Very good. Josh?
I think my tip is that communications has as much to learn from research as research does from communications. I think that well-researched communications involves knowing who your audience is. It involves knowing who the right journalists are. It involves knowing the right channels. All of those things that we think increasingly are important for insights and planning a good strategy. And similarly, from a research perspective, well-communicated research is good research. It doesn't matter how great your sampling strategy is. It doesn't matter how precise your numbers are. If your research is not communicated in a way that is accurate and also persuasive and straddles that very tricky line, then it simply won't be effective in achieving your goals.
Well, that's a fantastic set of tips to end on. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Charles, Helen and Josh, for being such a great panel. Very interesting indeed. And thank you also to Lansons, who are sponsoring this podcast.